So welcome back, guys. I hope you're having a really lovely week and you're enjoying your meditations this week. It is a great pleasure to introduce Chris Baker here today, who runs a company based in Cornwall called Mind Clear. So Chris, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and a little bit about your work to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks very much for having me, Jerry. So Mind Clear essentially is it's a training and coaching business where I focus on two main areas. I focus on well-being and I focus on performance. And I primarily work with businesses. So from the training side of things, I go in and run training workshops or run webinars, as I've been doing a lot more recently. And I coach people one-on-one within bigger businesses and also small business owners and entrepreneurs and people who are wanting to set up their own businesses. And the reason that we kind of look at the two core areas of well-being and performance is well-being really looks at the mental, the physical and the emotional aspects of well-being. So the internal elements of what then drives behavior. So performance is really the external behavioral aspects of the things that we do. But I think, a lot of the time we don't really give enough attention and awareness to the internal aspects that are driving our behavior. So the thoughts that we're having, the belief systems that underpin those, the emotional charges that we hold in relation to all of that, and the perceptions and the meanings that we're attributing to things. So then it's, that is what drives what we do. So if we don't have awareness around that, then it's very hard to change what we do and how we go about doing things and how we can do things in a more efficient way or a way that feels better or a more productive way. So, a lot of my work in businesses is around productivity and performance, but being able to do those things while sustaining our well-being. So we're not kind of maximizing our productivity, but burning ourselves out. So, it's finding the balance between those things.
Yeah. Sounds perfect. And the name, sort of where did that come from?
Well, I think, so Mind Clear, it's to me, that is the core of everything. To be able to have clarity of mind is what drives everything else. It's what drives our emotional state, and is what, as I said, drives our behavior. So that, is the kind of essence, I think, of what it is to live a good life. If we've got clarity of mind, which doesn't mean we need to kind of escape our thoughts and get rid of our thoughts, but it's our ability to start to recognize how our thinking and our belief systems are driving our behavior. So that's kind of the core of, if we can achieve a certain degree of mental clarity, then we can start to go about doing things in the world better.
Yeah, and live well. And so I guess kind of meditation, I know is a core part of your offering, but also, your personal life too. So could you just talk us through kind of your own personal journey with meditation?
Yeah, so I guess I've always had an interest in meditation, in any sort of personal development and sort of spiritual practices. Going right back, I remember, my mum has always been quite spiritual, and then my dad's kind of the kind of the opposite to that, where he's very sort of, set in his ways, hard work, get a job, earn money, whereas my mum's a bit more kind of open and spiritual. And so, she used to take me off to, I remember like when I was 10 years old, she took me to the Mind, Body, Spirit Festival, and I had my aura read or a photograph of my aura taken. And I was just absolutely, just really amazed by that and really taken by that. So, it's kind of been an evolving process, my spiritual practice and my meditation practices. I remember, so initially I kind of, when I grew up and sort of went out into the world, I was very much sort of going down that path of the traditional, sort of narrative of what my dad would have wanted, get a job, get security, doesn't matter what the job is, as long as it's making you an income, doesn't matter if you don't enjoy it. But, I was always kind of countering that with reading, and I remember, reading my first Tony Robbins book, and that really inspired me when I was like 17. And then evolving in my practice. So, over the years, I've studied a lot of different modalities and, qualified in neurolinguistic programming and as a clinical hypnotherapist, as a meditation and mindfulness teacher, looking at a broad range of different meditation techniques, from mindfulness to visualization to mantra-based to breath awareness. And breath work is something I've sort of studied a bit of. Incorporated elements of sort of acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a mindfulness-based form of therapy, and performance coaching as well. So, I've kind of brought all those into the bucket of what I do. So I wouldn't kind of say what I do is any one thing. It's kind of the amalgamation of different areas that I've studied and different things that I've tried, and I found that work for me. So, over the years, a lot of my practice was really just for my own well-being, and for a large part of, so up until I was mid to late 30s, I was doing work that I wasn't really, that was the work that I just kind of fell into that wasn't particularly enjoying. So I'd have all these practices just to help maintain my well-being. But the more I practiced it, the more I knew that this is what I'm passionate about, and that's when I sort of moved into setting up MindClear, and just starting with a blog, and then just transitioning into training, and now obviously running it full time for the last 3 or 4 years. So I kind of joke that took me sort of 20 years of working to work out actually what I really wanted to do with my life, which to me is still good. I think if you can find what you're really passionate about and you can transition into that, then it doesn't matter when you do it, as long as you do it, rather than knowing that you've got that thing you want to do, but never getting around to doing it.
Yeah. Fascinating as well. So, and it's almost, I guess, now going into businesses, perhaps, without that solid experience of really understanding the way that, it feels, it operates, the mentality of businesses, perhaps your offering wouldn't have been as strong. And it's also fascinating sort of, hearing about your upbringing as well, and kind of that sort of spiritual versus non-spiritual, or whatever, with your mum.
Traditional, yeah,
traditional. And then, I guess your offering feels like it does have sort of that feet in both camps. So it's kind of, it's real and relatable, but it also has the depth of meaning to it as well. So it's quite fascinating
that's completely right. And I'm very conscious when I am going into businesses, because I work with big insurance companies in the city, and a whole range of different businesses. So I need to make sure that what I'm saying is relatable to the people that I'm talking with. If I start talking about Buddhist practices or anything that they might have certain preconceptions around, then I'm not going to, they're probably going to switch off. But if I can relate to where they're at, and ultimately, a lot of those people are just quite stressed in their work, and they're just looking for relief from that. Now, that's not where I'm at with my own practice. I don't just meditate just to relieve stress. But if that's the entry point for them and that's going to work for them, then that's where I'll start with them. And hopefully they'll realize, oh, this meditation thing, this actually works. It's relieving my stress. Oh, I should find out a bit more about this. And then they can start thinking about the nature of consciousness and the interconnection of all things, and start expanding in that awareness. But I think it is really important that you meet people where they're at in order to kind of engage them. So
I completely agree. And sort of in your own practices then, kind of, what does your own personal practice kind of look like, and really kind of, what draws you there, kind of, and what's your why, like why meditation, and what do you get from it?
Well, I mean, my tagline for MindClear is consciousness evolution. And, you know, I guess my why is to help shift the level of consciousness of humanity, to make a contribution towards that. Now, you know, I certainly don't think through what I'm doing at the moment, you know, I'm going to be responsible for shifting the whole of humanity's consciousness. But I think if I can play a small part in moving consciousness in the right direction, then you know, that's going to have a positive impact on us, on others, and on the planet. Because at the moment, you know, climate change, you know, a lot of our conditioning is very based in fear, I would say. And self-interest. You know, this whole kind of, our whole economic systems are around, you know, what can I get for myself? You know, whether that's companies trying to make as much profit for themselves as possible, or people trying to accumulate as much material, as many material possessions for themselves as possible. And, you know, it's just a finite game. You know, ultimately, that is going to be our downfall, and it's very based in fear. You know, how much can I get for myself? That's very greed orientated, and you know, we can get more into this, but you know, fear is really derived from the mind and the brain, and if we get caught up in that space, then you know, we'll always be operating from that, what I would term as a lower level consciousness. Whereas if people can, and also, you know, that's never going to give people what they want. You know, in one of my workshops, I start the workshop by asking people, you know, what do you want? Like, what do you want from life? You know, which kind of catches people off guard a little bit. But you know, more or less, the unanimous kind of answer is they want happiness or contentment or joy. Either way, whatever, like, you know, some variation of that, what they want is a feeling. You know, so ultimately what every human is seeking is an emotional state. But we've been conditioned into this narrative around the fact that all these external things is what will give us those feelings that we're looking for. You know, if we have the bigger house and the nice car and the security and that's where we'll get the feeling from, which is obviously a convenient narrative for any organization that's trying to you know, create profit, but it's not what gives lasting happiness and contentment, because we can see that if that was the case, all the richest people in the world would be the happiest and all the poorest would be miserable, and you know, it's very often the opposite. But yeah, certainly the richest aren't the happiest. So yeah, I help people to, you know, so this idea of evolving consciousness is to recognize where happiness comes from, and that it's an internally generated, natural arising emotion when we are connected to who we are, when we're connected to, you know, our place in the universe and the planet, and the fact that we are, you know, everything is interconnected and we are part of nature and we're not separate from nature. And you know, this, you know, it's often our intellect that thinks that we're kind of separate from nature. Then we come from a place of generosity and kindness and virtue and giving, and that is ultimately what leads to a greater sense of fulfillment. You know, when we're not viewing the world through a lens of lack and fear, you know, we're viewing it through a lens of fullness. You know, I've got everything I need. I don't need any of those external things. You know, happiness is something that arises from within me when my mind isn't impeding my experience of life. Then I can be more giving, and we can work together ultimately to you know, make sure that this planet is looked after, to look after each other, to look after the poor, to make sure that everyone has a good enough standard of living. You know, that to me is, so that's the long answer to your question. My why is to help people move from that fear-based level of consciousness, which I would define as a constricted consciousness, to an expanded consciousness, which is more heart-based and based in love and contribution. So And
Beautiful answer. So
ultimately that comes down to um, recognizing that a lot of what impedes us is driven by the mind.
And kind of how do you see, so how is meditation sort of linked to that, or how do you view meditation as a way of kind of experiencing that expanded consciousness, or kind of being part of that catalyst of movement?
Yeah, well, I think the core thing with meditation is it is a practice like any other skill. So a lot of research now shows that the more we meditate, we are actually changing the function of the brain.
It's my neighbour, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So we are literally changing the grey matter in the brain. So we are, in some of my workshops, if I am kind of just introducing the concept of meditation to people who've never meditated before, I describe it as a form of mental fitness training. That we go to the gym to work on our physical fitness and build our physical muscle, but if we meditate on a regular basis, we build our mental fitness and our mental muscle. And really, what I'm kind of alluding to there, and the benefit that I see meditation having, is it starts to enable us to recognize that we are not our thoughts, because I think if we are living in a place where we're very fused with our thinking, and especially if our thinking is quite negative or restrictive, then obviously that's going to really determine our outlook and what we do. So we can start to recognize that actually our thoughts are just something that's going on inside our head. And also, whatever we're thinking, as I was saying at the beginning, is what drives what we feel, and it drives what we perceive, around us, and then that's what drives what we do. So to recognize that the mind is always kind of it's adding to our experience of life. It's not, if we can learn to sort of create some separation between us as an awareness and the thoughts that we're having, and we can still use the mind for when we need to do complicated sums and think about really complicated things, but to recognize that it is not us, and it's adding a layer, it's adding a kind of filter to how we're seeing things. So if we can just pull that filter away, then we can see what is rather than what we think is. So we're putting away our perceptions and our kind of clouding, and then all the judgments that we hold, what's right and wrong and what should and shouldn't be, because that's, and we can get onto that sort of resisting change, but that's where the resistance to change comes from, because it's our mind saying what it thinks should be the case, as opposed to just accepting what is.
Like
so
it's preference of the way things are.
Yeah.
I want it to be my way.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not my ideal. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess sort of leading on to that idea of change. Currently we're having this conversation still in lockdown. Where I think we've all kind of had to adapt very quickly in ways that are not of our choosing, and so kind of this idea of expanded consciousness and kind of using meditation as a vehicle for kind of for resting in that space, or kind of bridge it, or sort of making that gap between thoughts and the seat of awareness sort of wider. Kind of how does that kind of help us in sort of allowing that constant state of impermanence that life is, and kind of can you share any kind of wisdom or any personal experiences of kind of how your understanding of consciousness and meditation has kind of helped in that idea of change and letting go and impermanence?
Yeah, so like you say, I mean, impermanence is just what is. All conditioned things, as the Buddha said, all conditioned things are impermanent. Everything that arises must fall away, including us, our bodies will die, including the planet that we live on. Ultimately, at some stage, will fall away. But obviously, these are all working on different timeframes, but everything is always constantly moving and in motion and changing. And there's this paradox where we've got all this level of everything is constantly in motion and changing. However, as I was saying, our brain, the number one job of our brain is to keep us safe. And this is a kind of primal hardwiring that is the same in every single person. So we are always on the lookout for threats within our environment. And as a byproduct of that, our natural want is to have certainty, because if we've got certainty, it means predictability. If we kind of have a good idea of what's going to happen when we walk around the corner, then we feel safe. But if we have no idea what's going to happen when we walk around the corner, and that creates uncertainty, the brain will naturally, we've got a natural inclination to be biased towards negativity, because it's a lot more safe to be thinking about what the worst case scenario might be, rather than just be blasé and not worried about it, because that's not how humans evolve. Humans evolved by making sure that we looked after ourselves, and the person who didn't really care was the one who went off wandering into the jungle and then got eaten by the lions and the tigers. So it's much better to kind of stay in a group and make sure that we keep our wits about us. So, we've still got the same brains as our hunter-gatherer ancestors, but we're living in a very different world now, where we're perceiving a lot of things as threats. Now, obviously at the moment with coronavirus, that is a real threat, but how much extra are we adding to the potential, to the perceived threat around it? If you look at the actual figures of the likelihood of dying from coronavirus, and obviously all the people who have died is terrible. But still the likelihood of dying is very small. But if we're walking around constantly in a state of fear, that's going to add to our suffering and our sense of dis-ease within ourselves, when we might not even contract the virus. So going back to that analogy of kind of walking around the corner, it's much better to our brain thinks it's much better to kind of think of the worst case scenario, rather than just kind of not caring. So that's why we like to have certainty, because uncertainty basically means that we will kind of think of what's the worst case scenario. So again, coming back to coronavirus, that's thrust us into this world of uncertainty. Not only fear around maybe we might contract the virus every time we go outside, but also again, and this is a real a real fear. It's not like just a made up one, say around our own personal security. If people's livelihoods have been affected by this, and they're not making an income, and they can't pay the rent or they can't pay the mortgage, well, yes, that is a real that is something to be worried about. But again, how much is the mind adding to the amount of suffering that we're experiencing through constant worry and anxiety about what might happen going forward, as opposed to just where we're at right now? Are you still safe and have a roof over your head and still able to feed yourself at the moment? And in that moment, if the answer is yes, then all stress that we might be experiencing is purely based on the thought about projecting into the future, because there's that level of uncertainty. So, in terms of being able to accept that uncertainty and accept change, we need to realize that all of that worry is purely a projection based on thought alone. It's not real at this stage. And, you know, just as real as you might win the lottery next week. I mean, it's unlikely, but, you know, again, if you thought about that, if you thought, if I win the lottery at the weekend, then I'll be, you know, if your main worry is financial worry, then how would you feel just thinking that? You know, you'd feel, wow, that's a relief. Now, I'm not saying, again, it's going to happen, but isn't it amazing that just in that moment, right here, right now, we can be thinking about the worst case scenario, or we could be thinking about the completely opposite and how that has an emotional effect on our bodies in this moment. So just recognizing that it's the thought alone that is, you know, we're always living in the feeling of our thoughts in the moment, you know, so we're projecting into the future. So how much are we projecting based on fear and worry, because it's natural for our brain to be to kind of be based in fear about you know, what might happen, or are we just accepting what is? And so recognizing that actually, if we can going back to kind of diffusing from our thoughts and just recognizing that our thoughts is what's creating you know, the worry, rather than actually us being in real and present danger right here and right now. So, you know, so acceptance is really or surrender is really the key starting point to being able to accept uncertainty and change. That what is, and any emotional pain or suffering that we might be experiencing is purely based on our mind's projection about what might happen. So, you know, can we just actually be with what is? And so, you know, so there's 3 questions I always like to ask myself when I notice. You know, I find that actually noticing emotions is a good starting point, because, you know, we'll process things unconsciously. It's outside of our conscious awareness in terms of our thinking. So, you know, we'll just have a thought in our head that we're not aware of that will create worry, anxiety, stress, fear, whatever it is in the body, you know, so set off that fight or flight response. So we might get a quickening of the heart rate, we might get tension in our muscles, tension in our shoulders. So just to recognize when you are being triggered by something, you know, so recognize the emotional trigger, the emotional sensations, you know, the tension, the tightness, the qualities of that feeling. And when I recognize that, I always ask myself, what need, want, or desire is not currently being met? So what perceived need, want, and desire is not currently being met? Because then that takes me back to, well, what is it that I want, where there's a conflict of, you know, I'm either getting something that I don't want, or I'm not getting something that I do want. And, you know, based on what my mind wants, not what I want, what my mind wants. And then it could be something as simple as, I don't know, my dog often triggers me when I take it for a walk and he's very disobedient. And so he goes off wanting to play with all the other dogs. And that's not what I want. You know, I want my dog to come back. And this, you know, might sound trite, but I actually relate to that. You know, I get annoyed. I, you know, start to feel this, the sympathetic nervous system being activated, the fight, flight, or freeze response, or the stress response. Because in that moment, I want my dog to come back. So to notice that in that moment, oh, okay, I've noticed I'm starting to get annoyed. Can I just take a deep breath to start with, just to kind of anchor myself in the moment? And then the second question I ask myself is, can I be all right with this? Or can I just be with this? So rather than getting caught up in what the mind wants or doesn't want, just, you know, can I accept what is? You know, my dog wants to go and play. Can I just accept that? And that doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying to get him back, but I can just start to call him without that added level of annoyance. And then the third thing, so the third question I ask myself is, you know, how best can I respond to this situation? So again, rather than kind of getting really frustrated and angry, chasing him around the beach, you know, can I actually just remain calm, remain in the moment, because ultimately, this isn't something that I do need to get really in a whole load of turmoil over. So that's a very trite example, but it's absolutely, anything what I would say to anyone is the best thing you can practice is to notice what triggers you in anything, something that someone else says because they disagree with what you say. And so that's something you don't want. So, and a lot of the time, this stuff is it just doesn't really matter. We're getting so caught up in what I want and what I don't want and what our mind wants and doesn't want, because we're viewing things through the lens of what our mind wants. But can we just separate ourselves from that and just be in a place of open awareness, more connected to our heart, more compassionate? And when we recognize that, there is that conflict, can we just be with what is?
Yeah, that must be a beautiful practice to use with children and within a family as well. I know a lot of friends and a lot of people have said, sort of, in this current situation that we're all in, there's families often being in quite small spaces and just feeling quite confined, and even the added layer of homeschooling and that sort of thing as well. And there feels like there's been a little bit of a current of guilt amongst a few parents that I know that I'm snapping all the time, or I'm and it's it feels like that's a really beautiful practice that would be applicable to a lot of people right now. So I've got young kids and we are homeschooling at the moment, trying to balance work, and it is challenging when everyone's in the same space, because also stress is accumulative. That it could just be one thing happens in the morning, I don't know, you spill some coffee on yourself, and then something else happens, and you get a electricity bill in the post, and it's a lot more than you thought it was, and then one of your kids isn't doing what you're asking them to do, and that could just be the straw that breaks the camel's back. But all of those things, each one of those, coffee on your front, is, or spilt down your front, is isn't good or bad. It just is. Electricity bill isn't good or bad. It just is. Just because it's not what you expect it to be, it just is. And kids doing what they want to do because they're kids, again, it just is. So if we can just recognize that all of those things, what is the need, want, or desire that I want through the lens that I'm viewing the world, versus what I'm getting. And then it's and just by asking that question, it creates some space between the stimulus and the response as well. That if you get triggered by something, rather than reacting in a way that we might regret later, because especially when we do get really provoked, the whole idea of the amygdala hijack, which is part of the limbic system in the brain, which is responsible for your emotional processing. The amygdala lights up, so that's your fear response, and that clouds your logical thinking. So very often when people do stuff, when they react in a way that's very angry, to something that provokes them, it's because they're not thinking clearly, because the amygdala has kind of clouded any logical thinking that they're able to do. But in that moment, if we can ask that question, that creates some space, take a slow, deep breath, and then recognize that actually it's just because my mind wants something, but that's not who I am as a person. And I guess that's where the deeper meditation practice, that sort of, that sitting in open awareness it really allows us to be with all those things that kind of bubble up, as well as in the moment, like creating space. And there's what was running through my mind, like often, when you hear the Buddhist phrase, may all beings be free of suffering, I always feel like there's like an added bit that's missing, and it's kind of, may all beings be free of thinking that they're suffering. It's like the misinterpreted, sometimes we do suffer, that it's it's very human to feel those things, but yeah, the attachment that we have to the thoughts around suffering is almost the thing that that we need to let go of.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
um, and I guess that element of when if life is impermanent, it's about just trusting, having an element of trust in the unfolding, that one step might be in a direction that is not of our choosing, but that might lead on to a beautiful new step that we can sort of anticipate. And I guess kind of for you kind of personally, is there like a current of belief that drives a lot of the way you live your life, or your kind of your own beliefs? Is there kind of is there sort of a like a belief system that you feel is something that you live by? Is there a kind of a spiritual approach that kind of resonates with you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if there's any sort of spiritual approach that I've over the years been drawn to more and more, it's Buddhist
Yeah.
philosophy.
And why is that? What is it about that approach for you?
Well, I think because ultimately, what the Buddha was seeking was to the relief of suffering, the cessation of suffering. And like you said, because of much of the time, suffering is self-imposed. It's the way in which we're looking at things. The mind is adding to our experience, not having the experience. So, and he also said, don't take my word for it. Go out and try it for yourself, and see. So he wasn't kind of trying to indoctrinate people in a certain belief system. He was like, this is the way things are. I mean, that is the Dharma. The Dharma is just the way of things. It's not like it's an idea. It is just the realization of what is. So that, in terms of, I guess, a philosophy for myself, or an outlook for myself, the way in which I sort of try and go about doing things and being in the world is to practice, because I think, you can read a gazillion books, and I love reading books. But if you've only got an intellectual understanding of these things, then you're never really going to get a felt experience. And that's never going to really lead to kind of, I guess, if we're all trying to find enlightenment at the end of the road, and you can define that in different ways, and maybe not everyone is trying to find enlightenment. Maybe they're just trying to find relief from suffering in some way. But the only way in which we're going to walk towards that, we're going to move towards that, is through practice. So, for me, that is just about being committed to my meditation practice every day. And it's also about reconnecting. I guess, if there is an underlying philosophy, it's about reconnecting with the life that surrounds us, with our place in the universe, with the interconnectedness, as we were saying earlier, of all things. The fact that we are reliant on, to have this experience, this human experience, there's so many gazillion things that needed to come together to enable us to be here right now. From the sun to the wind to the rain to the sea to the oxygen that the trees are creating for us to breathe in. And like this, it's just amazing when you kind of take a step back and think about it. So by practicing and spending time in nature, going out and just sitting in nature and being still, and kind of that practice in itself starts to, anything that kind of is an embodied practice, I think is really important, so that we can, going back to the reason I call mind clear, that we can start to create some mental clarity, because I think, the mind is what impedes our level of consciousness. If we are rooted in a fear, this kind of fear orientation, which is generated from being fused with our thinking and our mind, that is going to impede our level of vitality and our level of consciousness, as opposed to if we can allow consciousness to flow freely and we can be more connected to our heart, which is kind of the kind of root of love and feeling connected, then that's when we're going to experience less suffering. And so going back to that point around Buddhism, ultimately the cessation of suffering, I guess, is what we're kind of seeking. So embodied practices, even yoga, where we can get into the flow of the postures and notice when our mind, when we're in a difficult posture and our mind is saying, I don't like this, or I also like getting into cold water, so swimming in the sea, or having ice baths, which has been really popularized lately by Wim Hof. I don't know if you've heard of Wim Hof, but a lot of that, I mean, obviously, cold water is good for you, but it's also the mental aspect. It's making yourself uncomfortable to recognize, to start to notice what the narrative of the mind is. Like, I don't like this, I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it. And you can just drop into a space of awareness, of being with your breath, of just kind of being present, noticing the activity of the mind. And then similar with meditation, just to sit and notice the activity of the mind. My practice now is to incorporate a certain amount of breath work, and then just to not really do a mindfulness based meditation, because I think mindfulness still kind of keeps an aspect of the mind active. If we're being aware of our thinking, we're still utilizing an aspect of our mind. So I try to just really drop into just a very pure embodied awareness, where my awareness is coming purely from my heart space, rather than any activity in my mind.
So if you were going to offer kind of one sort of tip or suggestion or encouragement for people to really drop down into that, like that embodied awareness, like from the heart space, what would your kind of, I mean, you've offered some beautiful ones already, but kind of, as a sort of a parting tip or encouragement, what would that be to kind of really embody the heart space?
Yeah, well, I think the number one most simple thing that anyone can do, and you can do it anytime, anywhere, is to use your breath. Because not only is our breath directly linked to our physiology, i.e. like when we're stressed, our breathing is very fast and shallow. And when we're relaxed, it's slower, deeper, and in more from the belly. But also, when we slow down our breathing and we become more centered, that starts to connect us, it starts to pull us away from being caught up in our thoughts. So just as a very simple practical tip, so the two things: notice your triggers, going back to what I was saying before. So notice what is setting you off, where is that conflict of what you want, and you're not getting, or what you don't want and you are getting. But then also just to slow down your breathing. So just breathe into the belly, breathe slowly, breathe in through the nose for a count of 5 seconds, just a slow exhale through the nose or through the mouth with a bit of a sigh, just a slightly longer exhale. So 6 or 7 second exhale. Do that 5 times, and that in itself, just as a simple practical thing, just pulls us out of kind of being caught up in those thoughts. So
beautiful. I feel like saying, and then see how you feel after you saying that, if you've noticed and you've practiced, and then see how you feel, and inevitably there'll be some sort of change. But that was fascinating and beautiful conversation. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
And if people do want to kind of find out more about your workshops or your one-to-one stuff, where's the best place that they can find you or contact you?
So my website, which is getmindclear.com, or on social media, so Instagram, I'm at getmindclear.
Perfect.
Sort of the main places.
Yeah, that was absolutely fascinating, and I've scribbled down loads of notes, which actually, like, I've scribbled them down so quick I may not even be able to read them myself. But let's have a look to see if I can figure out. So I've got the things I've circled actually is evolving consciousness, a shift from what I can get to what I can give, a shift from fear to love. Everything is connected. Fear is a lower level of consciousness, and that's when you were talking about that evolving consciousness. What else have we got here? Where am I right now? That felt empowering. Mm. Oh, we're always living in the feelings of our thoughts.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful, I really love that way
Yeah.
of saying it. I'm not sure I've heard that way of saying it before. And that we're always living in the feelings of our thoughts, and that feels
Yeah.
empowering too. Um, the need, want, and desire of this moment. Can I be with what is? And 5,000 other notes, but we'll leave those
Cool.
there. But thank you so much for your time.
Nice pleasure. Good
And
to talk.
really, really interesting conversation. But thanks so much for now, Chris. Take care.
Thank you. See you.